I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history, we'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Welcome to BattleWalks, where we're walking in the footsteps of the soldiers who fought in the First and Second World War. And thank you for joining us for the second part of our series, Walking the Beaches of Anzac Cove at Gallipoli. It was great. If you haven't listened to last week, please go back and do that, because it won't make a lot of sense what we're talking about today if you don't hear the first instalment of this 2-episode special. But it was really great. I really loved what we did last week, exploring the northern part of the sector at Gallipoli where the Anzacs came ashore. And today we're going to do the southern part. And when I say we, joining me as always is Pete Smith. Pete, great to have you back.
Hi Matt, yep, great to be here again.
Now, we're in that strange time of the year, mate, when it's cold here and hot over there in France. How's it been? Have you had lots of sunny days to get out and walk the fields?
Yep, we've got the inflatable pool up in the garden, and walking the fields, it's not the ideal time. You need to be in the winter for that, when the ploughing's taken place. So great for walking, for doing a walks and wrecking the battlefield and having a wander through the edges of the woods, the ones that you can get into. And so it's a great time for doing that. If anything, slightly hot. We've been up to almost 30 yesterday, day before yesterday. Today we've got a bit of rain, or we've had a little bit of rain. It's very humid at the moment, but nice weather to be out and about.
Well, excellent. I'm looking forward to hearing some more of those amazing walks that you do across the battlefields, where you take your recorder and head out and actually do it live. We've got a few more of those coming up, and I really enjoy those. I'm looking forward to hearing them. Again, very jealous that I'm not there with you walking the fields. This is the time of year when we'd be normally together, when I'd be over there and you'd be there, and we'd lead in groups and catching up for a beer in Ypres, and it's crazy that we're stuck in our homes still.
I'm starting to dream about having a beer in Ypres.
Hopefully soon, mate. You'll be there a lot sooner than I will be, but the frothy beer, I'm sure, will be waiting for you, and Pete's chair will be set up in the bar next to the Menin Gate, and I'm sure it'll be good to be back there.
It will. It's going to be extended. It's got a lot bigger since last time we were there. They bought the shop next door, which is very sad, because that was a little military shop that was next door. That's gone, and the bar's extended. So it'll be interesting to see what they've done with it.
It's one thing Ypres needs more of, is more bars. So I'm glad to see that's that's happening. For people that haven't gone, sorry, Pete and I have wandered off a little bit of a private conversation here, but the town of Ypres is just amazing, and walking around those streets, soaking up the military history, and then ending your day with a steak and chips or a pot of Flemish stew, or the mussels in white wine, amazing, and of course many cold beers. It's a wonderful place to be. It's really good, and I know, Pete, you're desperate to get back up there, so hopefully it won't be long.
There's a fantastic range of beers as well, which is good.
We're not in Belgium today for today's podcast, of course. We're not even in France. We're back to Gallipoli, as we said, doing the southern sector of the Anzac landing beaches. And I think it's really interesting, Pete, that we had to even split this into 2 episodes. There's just so much to talk about. The area we covered in last week's podcast was, I would say, less than 2 kilometres we would have walked. That's the thing about Gallipoli, particularly the Anzac sector. Because they didn't succeed, because they didn't push very far inland, because all they established was a beachhead, it's a tiny area. The area is minuscule. It's the one thing that strikes people. They go, how did 50,000 men live and fight in this tiny space for 9 months? It's ridiculous, isn't it?
Oh, it's fascinating, because obviously we can't walk in all of the places where they were, because the rather spiky bushes. What are those bushes? I have no idea. Anyway, very thorny bushes that you can't get through, so you can't push into the undergrowth. Spiky is a good description. Spiky, painful. So you can't get into a lot of the places where the men actually were, unless you've had a fire or they've done some clearances, which they have been doing just recently. But it's so we're a bit limited into where we can actually walk, unless you're willing to push your way through, which we normally have a crack at. But it's absolutely fascinating, and it is very difficult to believe that so many men were packed into such a small area and so overlooked. I think that's the thing that I always find fascinating, is that they were so overlooked by the Turks once they realised that they were not going to move inland, and they were just trapped on those beaches.
And as we said, last week's podcast is a great demonstration of the fact that every square centimetre of soil at Gallipoli has a dozen stories associated with it. Everywhere you turn, And I would love to have been back there 50 years ago with veterans and just hear their stories, because every inch of that ground has just, and it's not just an event occurred there, but so many events throughout the campaign occurred in each spot. It's really quite remarkable, and we're going to continue that journey today by looking at this, the southern half of the sector. It's really quite special what we did last week, wasn't it, Pete? When you talk about North Beach, obviously Anzac Cove, Aribunu Cemetery. It's just a very special area.
It's extraordinary. It's because it's all battlefield. When we're here on the Western Front, we can walk behind the lines. Well, there is no behind the lines here, really. The behind the lines is on board a ship or back in Malta or on one of the Greek islands. So it's just extraordinary. If you're on the land, then you're in the front line. There's no second line. It's all the front line almost.
It must have been. Imagine what it was like in terms of the stress levels, in terms of the tension for the men, never getting a break. At least in France, they do a week in the front line, then they go back to some cosy billet behind the lines where they get a bath and some hot food and a glass of white wine if they were lucky in a local estaminet. Imagine what it was like being at Gallipoli and just constantly under fire, even when you were in the reserve area, even when you weren't fighting. Yeah. The risk of a stray bullet or a shell coming over was always top of your mind. Just extraordinary, the tension the men were under for the whole 9 months of the campaign.
Yeah, no day off. It was one of the things we forget on the Western Front, that the men had local leave. So very often, when they were pulled out the line behind the lines, training programs organised, but there were always times you could get away. So yeah, I think it's extraordinary that there was no getting away. There was no rest, and the heat or the cold and the food or the lack of it, it was constant. There was no getting away from it. So yeah, a very unusual, I suppose, battlefield in that sense, that there is no way you can get away from the physicality of it. The smell, just imagine, the smell would have been there all the time, no matter where you were.
It's often been said that new arrivals at Gallipoli could smell it before they could see it. Just the combination of corpses and human waste and rotting food, and it just was an absolute hell on earth. But again, read Peter Hart's book, The Gallipoli Evacuation, to get an insight into exactly what was going on in Gallipoli. The book is good because it doesn't just talk about the evacuation, it talks about the situation at Gallipoli later in the campaign, when the big offensives have died away and when everyone realised that not much was happening and really just dug in and got on with life. That's when Gallipoli became a real ordeal, when you just felt stuck there. And one of the things I noted in my research was that the rates of sickness and men reporting to medical aid posts really skyrocketed late in the campaign. And that wasn't because the men were any sicker or getting wounded more often. It was simply that they were getting disillusioned with the whole thing. And so they were seeking treatment for maladies that earlier in the campaign they would have just put up with and gotten on with the job. But late in the campaign, the rates of medical treatment really started to skyrocket as the men became disillusioned with the campaign. We can't spell out enough what a physical and a mental ordeal this was for the poor blokes that were there.
Well, many men became so ill that they actually were discharged back to Australia. I found it fascinating that it was a place, and that doesn't really happen on the Western Front. Illness is something that is not going to be too serious. I mean, obviously there are variations, but I mean the illnesses, trench foot, things like that, you will eventually recover from them, or not, as the case may be with trench foot, but there is a chance of recovery. But there were an awful lot of men that became so ill with enteric fever and various stomach bugs and ongoing diarrhea that they needed a real period of rest. And fairly gruesome time. Very hard work on your body, I think, no matter what, even without being wounded.
You can see why for the rest of the war that the men wore the little A on their colour patch. So they wore a colour patch on their shoulder indicating which battalion they were a part of, and on that, if they'd served at Gallipoli, they wore a little A on top of that colour patch, showing that they were an original Anzac. And so, as we touched on last week, when the veterans mentioned the word Anzac, they were usually referring to Gallipoli itself, the campaign, the Gallipoli campaign. And an Anzac, in terms of an individual, was a person who had enlisted early in the war and had served at Gallipoli. So we shouldn't forget that either, is this idea of the reverence for Gallipoli in Australia and New Zealand began during the war. By 1916, new recruits who were arriving in France were quite in awe of the veterans who'd served at Gallipoli. It's an extraordinary thing, Pete, how that connection with Gallipoli was so dominant throughout the entire war.
Well, I remember many, many years ago myself wondering, I wonder when first Anzac Day was. When did Anzac Day actually start? And it started in 1916. It started the following year. So it was something that was already high in the consciousness of Australia right the way from the year after the campaign.
I think it's great. We often, in Australia, when I do interviews and when I'm asked about it, I often say it's great the Western Front has received the dues that it's deserving of, which is very true. I'm glad the focus has shifted to the Western Front and it's not just all about Gallipoli. But in a very important way, when we remember what went on at Gallipoli, we are continuing that tradition that began during the war. So I think it's wonderful. It's a wonderful place to visit. It's just a wonderful part of Australia's history.
I agree entirely, and I'm very pleased, obviously, for the reason that I'm a guide on the Western Front and take an awful lot of Australians around the battlefields. But I'm glad that I described it, or I used to describe it, as the eye of Australia had moved. It's moved onto the Western Front, and I think it was about time it needed to move onto the Western Front. And it really starts just before the 90th anniversaries of the fighting here, and now it's well understood that this was a much more important place for Australians, really. I think it's just that Anzac holds your attention because it's the coming of age of Australia and all of those other things that are attached to it. But this is where Australia really came of age, certainly as a fighting force, is on the Western Front.
Well, there's still lots of really important things for us to see in our walk. So shall we begin walking, Pete, and exploring the southern sector of the Anzac sector? It's a really amazing area. As I said from last week, you can see just the huge number of sites there are to see here, and this walk will carry that on. So as you recall, we ended last week. We just scrambled up and down the little knoll of Araburnoo that overlooks the northern end of Anzac Cove. This was the first heights scaled by the Aussies when they landed at 4:30 a.m. on the 25th of April, 1915. So we've just scrambled up and back down again. So now we're back on the road in front of Araburnoo, overlooking Anzac Cove, and we're gonna turn left now as we've come back off the hill, so facing south, and we're gonna walk the full length of Anzac Cove on the road above the cove. As we said last week, you can't walk along. There's no access to the southern end of Anzac Cove, so if you were to walk along the beach, you would find yourself a bit stuck at the foot of a cliff at the far end. So don't walk along the beach. We're gonna walk along the road over the top of the beach, but it's good because it gives us a good perspective, Pete, out looking over the cove, out over the water where so much went on during the entire campaign.
As we touched upon last week, it's a great shame that this road is here in a way that we can't walk along the beach and get that feel of what it was really like to be on the beach. But I do like to think that the road is at least stopping more erosion. That's so long as the road remains. Of course, we can see as we walk along the road that it's actually being damaged by the sea and also by slides on the cliff face. So it's a problem, and it needs to be kept in. Since it's here, it now needs to be kept in good condition.
Yeah, the one shame is the cliff face. Now that, as we said last week, when they widened the road, they bulldozed a big chunk out of the cliff face, and that is the difficulty, because not just from an erosion perspective, but also it means you can't get a perspective of what the slopes above the beach used to be like. We should mention as well, the road was built during the campaign. This was an Anzac construction during the campaign. This is where mules and men would walk to get from one end of the cove to the other above the beach, and it was improved after the war. And if you've been to the War Memorial in Canberra, one of the most important exhibits, and the first thing everyone sees when they walk into the War Memorial in the entry hall, is the boat, the lifeboat from a British ship that was on the beach, was rowed in originally on the original Anzac Day, and is now pockmarked with bullet holes and this white timber, quite large rowboat from a ship, a British ship. And the fascinating thing about that is that it was the bullet holes don't come from the landing. This lighter was left on the beach for the entire campaign, and so no doubt picked up these bullet and shrapnel holes during the incessant firing of shells and bullets at the beach. So the bullet holes probably don't come from the landing, because as we said last week, the landing was pretty much unopposed. But interestingly, that boat, when Charles Bean returned to Gallipoli in 1918 and early 1919 and found the boat on the beach and decided this should be the focal point of a memorial back in Australia, they had to get it away from Anzac Cove, and the road that you're now standing on was so narrow and such a goat track, they couldn't carry the boat down the track. They actually had to cut the boat in half to get it along that goat track, and then reassemble it when it was brought back to Australia. So there always was a road here, but it was much more of a goat track. And in fact, later on around Hell's Spit, there is still the remains of the original road, which are crumbling so badly now that you can't walk on it. But there's a tiny little part of the original track that is still there at Hell's Spit. But just bear that in mind as you walk along this road, that the basis of the road that is there now was actually constructed by the Anzacs. So you are walking in their footsteps. Of course, the roadworks have changed it a lot. But had you been walking along here in 1915 during the campaign and you'd look to your left, so the sea is on your right, if you'd look to your left, the whole slope above you, the gullies and the tumbling down washaways and any little nook and cranny in this complicated, mad landscape would have had troops in it. Bivouacs, dugouts, hospitals, stores, ammunition dumps, supply dumps. There would have been mules going backwards and forwards, little fires burning at night. This would have been an absolute hive of activity. And I love, whenever you look at a map, Pete, you just see that the spirit of the Anzacs coming through. They named all of these gullies to reflect facets of life at Gallipoli. So Shrapnel Gully is the main one, which we'll come to shortly. But there was Bully Beef Gully, there was Howitzer Gully. Every little gully had a name which reflected life that was going on. And that's the point, that the time in the front lines was actually the smallest part of the time the troops spent at Gallipoli. The majority of their time, they were in these dugouts, in their bivouacs, in their tents, and their little scrapes and dugouts behind the line in areas just like this. It's an area that people overlook, Pete, when they just drive past on their way from one end of Anzac Cove to the other. But this was the home for an army for the best part of a year.
It's when you stand on the road looking up and you try to imagine it, it's very difficult to imagine, but that description is very good. It was dugouts on top of dugouts on top of dugouts, because as the slope rose, the little almost tracks, tiny goat tracks running backwards and forwards, and then men dug into the bank. Of course, that's the easiest way, just straight into the bank, and if you had a few sandbags, put a few sandbags around the entrance, and a bit of wriggly tin if you could find it, or more likely some old packing boxes filled with stones, some old ammunition boxes, and you tried to make yourself a little comfy home. And 10 to 1, when you went up to the front line and you came back, somebody else had pinched it, so you had to start again and make another one. So it was just this rabbit warren, almost literally a rabbit warren full of men. That and I always like to imagine from the boats. Of course, you could light the fires here inside your little dugout, because they couldn't be seen from further up, and the smoke dispersed fairly quickly. But if you were out at sea looking in, you must have seen all these little twinkling fires all over the side of the hillsides.
Just an extraordinary view. I think in things like the old miniseries Anzacs, they depicted it quite well. Even in Gallipoli, in the movie, the 81 film that Peter Weir made, they depict that life on the slopes very, very well. And, again, that's what we remember about Gallipoli, is the holding on. We don't remember triumphant charges and capturing large chunks of land. We remember just hanging on, and there's no more hanging on than being a soldier dug into these slopes. They're literally hanging on by the skin of their teeth, and really quite extraordinary. One of the things I always think about when I walk around this area too, Pete, is I think about what it must have looked like from the water, but I also think about, in the early weeks of the campaign, what it must have looked like looking out to sea and seeing all the ships of the British fleet and the activity as ships came in and out. But all of that changed quite significantly on the 25th of May when a terrible incident occurred, and it was shocking. It's reported in so many diaries and accounts that the big British warships were off the coast, were off Anzac Cove and providing support fire and blasting away at the Turks. One of those ships was the HMS Triumph. While the troops would have been shocked in the middle of the day to just watch her bobbing around in the water, firing her guns, doing what she was doing, when all of a sudden there was an explosion, and she lurched to starboard and then sank in about 40 minutes. The Germans had sent a submarine in there, and I'm always surprised by how effective German submarines were in and around Gallipoli. And Triumph sank in, as I said, in 40 minutes. Most of the men were able to get off because the water was so shallow. It's only 55 metres deep, so most of the men were able to get off. But 78 sailors were drowned. And that ship still remains there, as do half a dozen of these huge warships. Gallipoli is actually a really great dive site that people go to, and fairly recently begun diving on these big ships. But it's part of the campaign we don't really think about. We don't think about the naval aspects as much as we should. And we certainly don't think about German submarines sinking British warships in these shallow inland waters off the coast.
I think it must have been a shock to the men to actually watch the action taking place, to watch this ship, the explosion, and then it's slowly rolling over and sinking. But of course, for most of them, they would equally be aware that they're losing their artillery effectively, because the ships were their artillery support. So the ships that were not sunk all withdrew. So they're losing their immediate fire support from the ocean after the sinking of those warships.
It reminds me, a similar one is what happened in Guadalcanal during the opening days of the Guadalcanal campaign, when the Americans all came ashore and did quite well against the Japanese when they first landed on Guadalcanal. But there was a very big naval battle, the Battle of Savo Island, and after that the American Navy got a bit of a thumping, as did the Australian Navy that was there too. It was when we lost the Canberra, was sunk in that engagement. And the Navy decided it was just too dangerous to hang around, and so the Marines on Guadalcanal woke up one morning to discover the entire Navy that was protecting them had disappeared. Exactly the same at Gallipoli. Imagine the troops up on those slopes watching the Navy sail away. The Navy that had brought them there, the Navy that had supported them, the big brother that was always there to look after them, sailing off to distant islands because it was too unsafe. The isolation and the desertion would have been, the feelings you would have had would have been absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
And all of that took place from these slopes. I always think of that when I walk along this stretch.
Yeah. It also meant that their medical support was further away as well, because some of those ships that left had been used for medical support for the wounded, so that it also meant that their medical support was not as close as it had been.
We're going to continue walking along the road, Pete. We're heading south again. We're going to walk the full length of Anzac Cove, and you can look down on the cove and try and remember. There's nothing left from the campaign except for a couple of concrete slabs, which were the foundations for a water purification plant, which was built fairly late in the campaign. So as you can imagine, the army that lived on the slopes above you and on the beach at Anzac Cove was transitory. It was flimsy wooden piers, it was boxes of cargo and supplies, and when they left, they either destroyed it or left it for the Turks, or took it with them, and today there's nothing left. So it's incredible that for the best part of a year, this army could live and support itself, and then as soon as they left, they took everything with them, and within a period of weeks, the whole place was deserted. Really quite extraordinary. You can still see the foundations of the piers going out. On a clear day, you can look into the water and just see the remains of the piers snaking out, particularly from the higher ground that we're going to get to later on. But extraordinary, Pete, that an entire army could function, operate and live here, and then within a matter of weeks could just disappear into the night.
Yeah, it is, and of course, with the Turks being poor as well, and a lot of poor people living in the area who came back, they salvaged anything that could be salvaged, and so anything that was left is going to be used and taken away as well. So, in fact, within no doubt months of the evacuation, almost everything had gone. Everything that could have been used has been used and has been removed.
I like it in a lot of ways that it's now deserted. It's now just a beach, and you do have to use your imagination. It's an amazing thing, and usually when you go there, if you go there outside of Anzac Day, you will be on your own. There won't be any other visitors there. You'll be standing on Anzac Cove with the ghosts of 50,000 men and looking around, and you've just got the place yourself. There's virtually not a trace left, and it's I don't know what philosophically it says, but it's a remarkable feeling to visit Gallipoli and have the place to yourself when you know that during the campaign it was just such a hive of activity.
If you're an artist or a photographer, it's an absolute paradise, because the views are fantastic. As soon as you start climbing the bluffs and climbing the ridges, the views become immediate. So you have beautiful views you can take photographs of, and it's very easy to imagine what it was like when there were lots of people here, because there's nothing to impinge you, no buildings, no houses. It is the landscape is exactly the same. So I think it's a fantastic place to use your imagination.
It's we're going to keep walking now along Anzac Cove, and as we get to the southern end of the cove, we're going to come to a little white monument which simply marks the name Anzac Cove, and it's got it in both English, it says Anzac Cove, and also in Turkish, Anzac Koyu in Turkish, and it's at the southern end. And this is a good spot. Everyone stops here and gets a photo, but it's also probably the best spot to get a perspective on looking back across Anzac Cove, because even though you're up on high ground above the beach, you're still tucked in behind the slopes, and so this was actually a spot where photographers during the war took those famous photos of Anzac Cove. So it is a good spot to get as close as you can to a then and now comparison, but it's got the little white marker stone announcing that this is Anzac Cove, and that was put there in 1985. The cove was put there because As we said in last week's episode, it was known mostly just as the beach to the troops, and it was General Birdwood, who the commander of the Australians and New Zealanders, who said that it should be called Anzac Cove. But even after the campaign, it was never officially known as that until 1985, and then it was just it's such an insignificant little piece of geography that it never even had an official name. In even the Turks only referred to it as Ari Burnu, which is actually the northern point. So in 85 they renamed it Anzac Cove. But I thought, Pete, we might just talk about the description of General Birdwood and why he wanted to name it Anzac Cove. So this is what Charles Bean had to say within days of the landing, the description of what you would have seen from this point in 1915. General Birdwood asked that the beach between the two knolls, being the original landing place, should be known as Anzac Cove, and the name Anzac, till then the code name of the Army Corps, was gradually applied to the whole area. Day and night the cove was full of the noises and sights of a great harbour. Launches with tows moving constantly in and out, the shrill whistles of small crafts, the hoots of trawlers, the rattle of anchor chains, the hiss of escaping steam. At either end of the beach was the hospital, the New Zealand station at the north end, the Australian at the south. Colonels Howes and Giblin would not display the Red Cross on their station, crouched as it was among supply depots which the Turks might justifiably shell. Along the middle of the beach were long lines of picketed mules. Even by day, the strand between the growing supply stacks and the water was a crowded thoroughfare. Odd men, parties, strings of animals jostled through it, lucky if they had escaped the kick of a mule. During shell fire, the casual hands would quickly disappear behind stacks of biscuit boxes, but the working parties carried on without regarding it. And the other thing, of course, is swimming in the cove. There were always men swimming naked in the waters of the cove, just getting a break from the heat. And just that was probably the only good bit about serving at Gallipoli, was at the end of a long, hot day, you could go down and have a cooling dip in the ocean. But just, again, standing at this spot, Pete, trying to imagine what that was like. Absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think there's actually a photograph, isn't there, of Birdwood having a swim, I think, off the cove, if I remember rightly.
There is indeed. Stark naked, swimming off the cove.
That's
and it was
right.
distributed in Australia, and everyone was quite shocked. It was not widely distributed by the newspapers because they couldn't believe that their loyal commander was having a dip in the nuddy. So really quite extraordinary. The sensibilities in Australia compared to what was going on back at Gallipoli.
I think we should do a podcast about Birdwood. I think he's one of the forgotten commanders from the Australian perspective, because he's so overshadowed, I suppose, by Monash eventually. But I think he was an interesting chap, was Birdwood.
I agree entirely. He was British, but he was his heart rested with the Australians and New Zealanders that he commanded during the war. I think he actually applied. Didn't he apply to become Governor General of Australia?
He did. He certainly lived in Australia for a period after the war. And I think if he wasn't Governor General, he was certainly living in Australia. And fairly recently, within the last 10 years, his grave, which was getting into a bad state of disrepair, back in the UK, he died and was buried in the UK. And I'm not sure where he's buried, actually, but wherever it is, the Australian government paid for his grave to be renovated.
Another thing I'd say to every listener is jump on Google Maps or get a street directory out, and I guarantee that within a couple of kilometres of where you are currently sitting anywhere in Australia, there will be a Birdwood Avenue or a Birdwood Street or a Birdwood Park. He was revered in Australia. So if you see that Birdwood, you see it so many times. It's not a reference to bird watching. It's a reference to the great general from the First World War. So that's his decision to name it Anzac Cove. But known always to the troops, just as the beach. So we're going to continue on now, just past the monument. We should also say that the beach directly below where this monument is, Pete, was where the 3rd Field Ambulance dressing station was. Again, Charles Bean mentioned in that quote that the Australian hospital was nearby. Well, the 3rd Field Ambulance had their dressing station here. And why is that significant to us? It's significant because of probably the most famous Australian hero, who we will talk about in a little bit more detail coming up, John Simpson, the man with his donkey. It was from here that he left with his donkeys and headed up Shrapnel Gully. Of course, you can't do it today because the slope, as we've previously mentioned, restricts access from the beach, but the 3rd Field Ambulance was right below where you're now standing, and this is where Simpson left and indeed brought back wounded men on the donkeys. So it's an important little corner of the cove. We'll talk a bit more about Simpson as we go along.
Was his donkey actually a donkey, or was it a mule? I think it was probably a mule, wasn't it? I know he's always called a donkey, but were they using mules or were they using donkeys? There's a question.
Well, it's good. I'm no vet, but I think it was a donkey because the photos, they're quite small.
Yeah.
They're very small, and mules are large. Obviously, a mule being a donkey and a horse mated together. Mules are always quite large and good animals, but I think it probably was a donkey because it was very small with the long ears. So from what I've seen, it's a good question. Anyone listening who knows a little bit more about animal services than we do, there were definitely donkeys and mules there.
Yeah, they were.
But, I think Duffy was a donkey, but someone may please send us a message on Twitter or Facebook if you have more information about the species of animal he used. But we'll talk more about Simpson as we go on a little bit further. But I think let's talk a little bit, since I've touched on this, Pete, medical conditions at Gallipoli. Like, this was a key part of the whole story, and as I've said many times before, the great Peter Hart, the work I've done with him on Gallipoli, because he is the absolute expert on Gallipoli, talks a lot about the medical conditions. And his famous expression he's used many times is the flies that spread the dysentery at Gallipoli. He said flies have two favourite meals, shit and jam. And so they would fly from one to the other and spread the two to the humans that came in contact with them. Yeah. We cannot state enough. We cannot state enough. And, jokes aside, the misery of the medical situation at Gallipoli. Everyone had dysentery. I think it was Monash that said if he ever did a solid bowel movement again, he'd think he was in the family way, considering that just the state. And we shouldn't laugh. This is more than just having, a crook tummy. Yeah. We've all had diarrhea. We've all had traveller's tummy. This is so much more. And again, read the work done by Peter Hart on Gallipoli and the account that he gave from one of his veterans about losing a friend who they were all so weak from dysentery they carried their friend to the latrine. He toppled over and drowned in the muck of the latrine because they were just too weak to pull him out. They were all so weak from dysentery. This is just the most horrific way. And you think then, Pete, they're all in this condition. There's bloated corpses everywhere. There's flies. There's dysentery. And then they've got to fight. It's not just they've got to live and survive and basically they're out camping for 9 months. They've then got to grab kit and rifle and go and charge the enemy. How would you fight in that condition?
Well, I think this is when the character of men really came to the fore, because that's how you survive in these kind of conditions. You've got to have that extra bit of something about you, because if you haven't, then you'll give up. In these kind of conditions, if you've got dysentery and you can't eat properly, then effectively you're going to die, and you have to keep on eating and drinking, even though you know it's going to go straight through you, because at least something, you're taking some kind of goodness from it. And you've got to get yourself down to the medical aid post, and hopefully they will give you something, or if anything else, they'll just give you a stretcher to rest on for the day, and then expect to go back to the front again once you've rested a while, because that's sometimes all that is needed. Is just a half a day away from the front line where you can think about nothing and just lie down and try and get some proper sleep and drink an awful lot. And so it's really down to your mental outlook that is going to keep you in a condition where you can fight if you have to. But it must have been just hell when we all know what it's like when you don't feel very well and you still have to go to work and you still have to do something. It's not fun. And so if you can imagine these guys with various aspects of stomach problems, even if they haven't got actual dysentery, with bloated bowels and just feeling uncomfortable and ill and not able to eat. And let's face it, what they were eating was not good. It's all going to be tinned food, and as we discussed, if you can get it into your mouth before the flies get to it, then you're doing well. And then you've got the heat and the cold in the evenings as well, so a mixture. So all designed just to make you feel unwell, and just simple things like flu and colds would be completely out of proportion to what they would normally be because of the conditions. Just terrible. It's
Peter Hart, in a number of interviews I've done with him, because he was the oral historian at the Imperial War Museum for many years and interviewed dozens of Gallipoli veterans, and he makes the very important point that we only know what dysentery was like at Gallipoli because of oral history interviews, because men did not write it in their letters home. They didn't write it in their diary. They're not going to sit up and write in their diary, I had a terrible day and went to the toilet 20 times today. Not going to put that in their diary. They're certainly not going to write that to their wife or girlfriend or mother at home to explain what it was like. The only way we know about it is by the good work done by historians like Peter Hart, who sat these veterans down years later and said, tell me about dysentery. What was it like being that ill at Gallipoli? And that's how we have these stories. And it's just remarkable, because this is the important stuff we need to know. We would never know how debilitating that is unless that good work was done. So read Peter Hart's books, listen to his podcasts. Absolutely extraordinary, the work he did with Gallipoli veterans. But in places like where we're standing now, looking out at Anzac Cove, nice and peaceful, we're standing right near the hospital, and we should think about just the ordeal that Gallipoli was on the men. We just can't believe it. Absolutely extraordinary.
I sometimes use the comparison of Agincourt. I know it's a strange comparison, but a lot of the English army at Agincourt, so we're talking about a medieval battle here, and the archers had very bad dysentery, and they'd had it for some considerable time, to the extent where they were making a mess almost constantly, and so they removed the lower garments. So during the fighting at Agincourt, a lot of the archers had no lower garments on so that they could continue fighting while they had this terrible dysentery. And so it's a similar thing, really. You can imagine these guys would have been making a terrible mess while still expected to fight, and just horrendous. It just doesn't bear thinking about, really.
Just absolutely horrific, isn't it? I should also mention that the track that I was talking about, this is where you can see it, just behind the memorial is the remains of the original track that stretched all the way along the cove. So again, created by the Anzacs during the campaign, still there after the campaign, then expanded to make the road that you've just been walking on. This the knoll of land that sticks out at the southern end of Anzac Cove is known as Queensland Point, because the Queenslanders were the first men ashore, and it's, Queenslanders are normally quite humble, unlike them to name something after themselves. But no, good on our friends from Queensland. The first people ashore were Queenslanders, and they're very proud of that point. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to leave the monument, and we're going to walk down the road a little bit further, and then to the right there's a clearing. There's a bit of a track and a clearing up on a little hill to the right, and we're going to walk up there, and there's a Turkish memorial there to the men who first defended Anzac Cove. So this was the 8th Company of the 27th Regiment that faced the Anzacs when they first landed. So as we said, it wasn't even a full company, a half company of Turks. And the description in Turkish says, a platoon from the 8th Company of the 27th Infantry Regiment faced the first 1,500-man wave on the Anzac force, which landed on the shore near Aribonu in the early hours of 25th April 1915, and caused them great casualties, forcing them back to the steep slopes above the beach. It's not quite an accurate representation of what went on, but it's good that there's a monument there, just remembering what those men did, because an extraordinary achievement. As we said, less than 150 men. So the 1,500 men in the first wave, that was literally the first wave that landed, but 4,000 men landed in the first hour. And so for 150 men to face them was quite an extraordinary achievement. Most of those men fled. Valor is discretion is the better part of valor. They fled back into safe areas, but a number of them stayed and fought on and were killed at their posts trying to stop the Anzacs from landing. So a good spot to remember them. It's interesting, these memorials, Pete, isn't it? They're very large, these Turkish memorials. The Turks were actually quite late to the party in terms of putting memorials up around Gallipoli. Most of these were put up in the 80s. But it's good that they're redressing the balance now, that it used to be nothing but Anzac memorials all over this sector, and it was like the Turks weren't even there. It's good to see now that there's more memorials to the Turks coming up all over the place.
Yeah, I like to see it, because it's nice to get that juxtaposition of memorials and cemeteries. Sadly, the Turkish cemeteries, I don't know if we're going to talk about them during this podcast, but they're difficult. They're not always quite what they seem. But there's a lot of work being done, so there's archaeological work being done as well. So hopefully we'll see some more good memorials and interesting panels describing what was going on from a Turkish perspective. So it gives them a balanced view.
Well, we talked about this when we did our Second Ridge podcast, one of the first walks that we did in this series. So go back and listen to that one. I think second or third walk that we did, but that was along Second Ridge in Gallipoli, and we talked about the Turkish cemeteries and the sort of odd situation where the Turks were buried in mass graves, which since the campaign have been unmarked. But the Turks in the 80s and 90s began building artificial cemeteries, which had headstones but no bodies beneath the headstones. Yet the mass graves remained unmarked. Well, that's been redressed in recent years.
It has.
And the mass graves are now marked appropriately as well. So it's very good to see. But no, the Turkish memorials are fascinating, well worth going to. They're always written in Turkish, obviously, but also with an English translation. So well worth going to. And this is one. And we should remember that company that defended the beaches, which was an incredibly brave thing to do in the early days, the early hours of the entire Gallipoli campaign. If we stand next to this memorial, Pete, and we look inland, we're looking straight into the famous Shrapnel Gully. And now, again, quirks of geography that led to the Anzacs being able to survive in this area. Had it just been a bare slope leading up to the ridges, there was no way the Anzacs would have been able to hang on for more than a few hours, because they would have been forced off by the Turks. But again, through a fluke of geography, there were these little ridges and washaways and gullies, which actually led all the way up to what would become the front line. So from the beach up to the second ridge, which was the front line, and again, go back and listen to our other podcast to hear all about Second Ridge. But between the beach at Anzac Cove and Second Ridge was this series of gullies, which gave protection to troops. And it was actually a very, very busy thoroughfare, Shrapnel Valley leading up. Shrapnel Valley, as it was known to the British, Shrapnel Gully, known to the Anzacs. But Shrapnel Gully led to Monash Valley, named after Colonel Monash, who commanded some of the Australians, and led all the way to the front line. So had it not been for these gullies and little protected niches, the Anzacs would never have been able to make it from the beach to the front line.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's all. It doesn't really make any difference, but to my mind, Shrapnel Valley is a better description of Shrapnel Gully. A gully, to my mind, is something that's steep and very narrow, whereas Shrapnel Gully stroke Valley is a valley. It's quite a wide expanse, relatively speaking, for this area. Some of the gullies are literally just grooves in the ground, almost just like a trench. But Shrapnel Valley or Shrapnel Gully is wide. It's a wide expanse. It's going to be wide enough to put a cemetery in there. It was wide enough to have supplies stored there, and also for men to walk up and down in 3 or 4 or 5 abreast. So it's a big valley, a big gully in an area of very narrow gullies.
This is a fantastic spot to imagine what that was like, because it's really important, again, when we need to get our head around the busyness and the frantic nature of life, the chaos that often went on at Gallipoli during the campaign. And this is Shrapnel Gully was central to that, and this is a great spot to get an impression of what that would have been like. So just imagine just a constant stream of men going up to the front line, men coming back, wounded men on stretchers, mules carrying loads up, shells exploding, shrapnel shells exploding above the gully. It was called Shrapnel Gully for a reason. Shrapnel shells exploding and firing pellets down into the valley, occasional snipers shot ringing out, working parties heading up with sandbags and barbed wire, just constant bustle. Ration parties heading up with food, just constant
mules,
bustle,
donkeys,
noise, horses, the whole lot going on. Just a hive of activity all the way up. The whole slopes.
Even artillery. There were artillery here, weren't there, as well?
Yeah, exactly. Artillery pieces.
Artillery here.
The slopes were completely stripped of vegetation, which was used for firewood and because of the digging of trenches and dugouts. So bare slopes and men just coming back up, dusty in summer, freezing cold and snowy in winter. Just a hive of activity going up through here. Again, it's very difficult to stand in this spot and imagine it, but try in your mind's eye to imagine what was going on. And actually, maybe another quote, Pete, about a little bit what was going on here. This is about, even though these gullies gave a measure of safety, the Turks were always quite ingenious, and especially in the early part of the campaign, the Turks realised that there were men coming up and down these gullies, and snipers in particular crept forward to very exposed positions so that they could fire down into the gully. And so this is what someone said. This is actually quite a way into the campaign. This is not the opening days. This was several months into the campaign. So a party of us volunteered for a sapping job last night. We left camp at 11 and followed the road, which is in the gully bottom, meandering up to the firing line. Across the gully are built sandbag barricades which shield a man just a little from the death traps along the road. We would bend our backs and run to a big barricade, lean against the bags until we panted back our breath, then dive around the corner and rush for the next barricade. The bullets that flew in between each barricade did not lend wings to our feet, for nothing could have made us run faster. A few 100 yards ahead of us and high up is the firing line, perched precariously on a circle of frowning cliffs. The Turks have a special trench up there which commands our road. The trench is filled with expert snipers, unerring shots who have killed God only knows how many of our men when coming along the road. So even my description was a little bit false that I gave of men, sort of chugging their way up the slopes. There were sandbag walls to shield them from the snipers, and men running between the posts. It got better as the fighting went on, and the Turks were pushed back a little bit. But in the opening days of the campaign, the opening months of the campaign, this was a bit of a death trap. And as he said, God only knows how many men were killed by snipers heading up and down Shrapnel Valley.
I think a lot of movements, a lot of the greater movement was done in the dark to give you a better chance of surviving.
The two of the most famous people obviously killed at Gallipoli were killed by snipers, or at least by bullets in Shrapnel Valley. That was the aforementioned Simpson with his donkey. He was killed only a few weeks into the campaign, leading his donkey up through Shrapnel Valley. And of course, General Bridges, the commander of the Australians, who had established the Australian forces, he established the RAF at the start of the war, and was the first commander of Duntroon in Canberra, and had established the Australian forces. He was hit in the thigh by a sniper in Shrapnel Valley, heading up, and then died on a hospital ship. So he's the only until the Unknown Soldier was sent back to from Villers-Bretonneux in 1993. General Bridges was the only Australian killed in the war whose body was returned to Australia, and he's buried at Duntroon in Canberra. So a very important spot, and it demonstrates just the risky nature, the amount of fire that went on there, and the fact that you're taking your life in your hands every time you went up Shrapnel Gully. And this is a great spot to see it. You can also look dead ahead. You can see on the ridge line ahead of you, that was the front line. And you can see the big Turkish memorial, the big yellow memorial on the skyline marking the front line. And you can also see from here, you can see Quinn's Post. You can see all the key Australian and New Zealand points on the front line. Just a really great perspective. Great to come and see the Turkish memorial, but also great to get this perspective, slightly elevated ground, to look back up the gully all the way to the front line.
My description would be horrific perspective, because it's certainly on my very first visit, it's when I realised how terrible the location was, when you realise that is where the Turkish trenches are, and you can actually see them, or at least you can see the lips of our trenches and know that the Turks are just beyond them, and you realise what a terrible, terrible location it is to try and hang on to.
It must have been a constant cause of stress to the men, was being able to look up and obviously hear the fire, gunfire all the time coming from the front line, shouts of men in the front line, explosions from grenades, artillery going off. It was a constant din. That was how it was described.
Turkish bugles.
Exactly. A constant din was how it was described, the noise from the front line. It's not far away. It wouldn't be a mile, would it, Pete, from the beach to the front line?
No.
Less.
And it would echo. It would echo in these valleys. It would echo as well.
Charles Bean said that men walking along the beach used to look up at the front line as a man looked at a haunted house, just thinking that I'll soon be back up there. You couldn't escape from it. That's what we've said before. But just imagine what it was like. You're standing here now, looking up, and less than a mile in the distance, you can see the front line. Well, a gunshot will carry much further than that. And you would hear everything that was going on in that front line, the constant din of fighting, knowing that you would soon be back up in it again. They're just the constant stress they had to live with. And again, points like this are great places to remember it from. I mean, Pete, you a military man yourself, you spent a lot of time, I know that you weren't in combat, but you've spent a lot of time around veterans, both of current and previous wars. That must be something that's a recurring theme, is that the stress of, even when you're not in battle, knowing that tomorrow or in a few days' time, you're going to be back amongst it. I've read accounts from veterans, they talk about that time going back, when it was time to come out of rest and head back into the front line, that it was something they were dreading. You must have come across that in your experience of talking to veterans.
I think Afghanistan's a very good example of that. There was nowhere safe. So wherever you were, if you were a frontline infantryman or serving in the front line in Afghanistan, then there really is no front line. Your patrol base is just as susceptible to fire as when you're out on patrol. So there was never a period. Flying in, you put your helmet and your flak jacket on as you arrived on the plane, as you were arriving in Kandahar, and effectively you never took it off. So just extraordinary. That's an exaggeration, but you'll know what I mean. It was a difficult place.
Well, your son served in Afghanistan, and you obviously know his friends as well who served alongside. So Pete has an excellent perspective from both his time. I mean, your son, Royal Matthew, a Royal Marine, just like his dad.
Yeah,
so,
Royal Marine. Yeah,
so
exactly.
A shout out to our currently serving members as well, and the veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq, because a lot of this stuff, I think we're talking about to people like, well, not you, Pete, but to me, a lot of this is a hypothetical. Yeah. But there are a lot of people listening to this who know exactly what we're talking about in terms of the stresses of combat. So a shout out to those people who are basically reliving this experience we're describing here as in detail. Yeah. So this is a good spot for that perspective of the front line. You can see up Shrapnel Valley, where it takes a big dog leg to the left. It then becomes Monash Valley, named after Colonel Monash, as we said, who commanded the 4th Brigade at Gallipoli. Yep. What we're going to do now, Pete, is we're going to, just before we leave this area, there's a little bit of Matt's secret spots here that most people don't see, but I always like to take people here. It's the thing about Gallipoli. You always want to know the little secret spots that most people don't go to. So, I revealed it in my book, so it's not exactly a hidden story now. Yeah. But if you carry on past the Turkish Memorial, it's not even a track. It's really just a sort of a beaten area through the scrub. But if you follow that area past the Turkish Memorial, so into the scrub, you then come to a trench. There's a trench there on this hill out overlooking the water. And this is one of the original trenches defended by the Turks during the landing. And again, an amazing spot, quite a deep trench as well. And you can actually stand in this spot. You don't get good views anymore because there's trees in the way, but this was a trench dug by the Turks and looking out over the water. Absolutely extraordinary to stand in this spot. And again, think of the men who were here in the early hours of the campaign and the 25th of April.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's those little secret spots, those little bits of fragments of the battlefield where you really get a feel of what it was like. There's a well worth tracking down.
So we're going to, after that, we're going to head back down from the trench. We're going to cross the road and we're going to head into Shrapnel Valley Cemetery, one of the most important cemeteries in the Anzac sector. I think the largest cemetery in the Anzac sector. And just really important. Pete, it really tells it's a place you can spend hours in because it tells the whole story of the campaign. There's graves there from the first day. There's graves there from the last day. And from pretty much every campaign in between. Just a really extraordinary spot and a beautiful spot as well.
It's got a fascinating story as well. I mean, it's a true battlefield cemetery again. It's not a concentration cemetery. This was a cemetery created at the time for soldiers who were being killed in the front line and their bodies brought back, or soldiers dying of their wounds in the 3rd Field Ambulance and being brought here to be buried. Men killed by snipers close by, men killed by shellfire close by who are buried here. So it's a fascinating cemetery and again just an interesting story in the sense that everybody was lost for a period because the markers that had marked all their graves after we'd been evacuated, the Turks are going to use the markers as firewood, or they're just going to rot away or get moved by wild animals, and so eventually it's impossible to say where anybody was, and at that period the Pope intervened. He wanted to know that the graves were being, of course it was a big worry to it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it, in the middle of a war, but it was a massive worry to governments and to the men themselves of what were their friends that they'd left there, where their graves being looked after, and the Pope got involved and he requested that an envoy should be sent to see if the graves had been looked after, and of course they weren't. And so I believe the Turks had to make up graves all over the site to make it look like the graves were being looked after. But as was discovered in 1918, 1919, 1920, when we came back and started to recover the bodies, that nobody was in the right place. And in fact, they ended up having to probe for bodies to find out where the bodies were so that they could then remark them properly. I had the interesting experience several years ago now of having a friend that came to stay when we ran a bed and breakfast, and he brought one of the original probes. His grandfather had been in a body recovery unit working on the Western Front, but same idea, and they were using the old cleaning rods from the machine guns that they would extend them, they'd welded another bit onto them to make them a little bit longer. And then horrifically at the end they'd put what I could only describe as a cheese tester at the end of them, and these things were then dug into the ground and wiggled about when they thought there was a body there, and then pulled out, and of course the smell that had been held in this little cheese tester in the end would tell you whether there was something buried beneath there, and so they would know then that there was a body there and mark that body. So fairly horrific story, but you can see that the ends that they had to go to try and relocate where the soldiers had been buried in this cemetery. So I think the story of the cemetery in its own right is just its loss, and then the way it looks now, it's beautiful now, flowers and trees and rubble walls around it. It's a beautiful cemetery.
It's got that spectacular Judas tree in it, which blossoms at Anzac Day every year. It's
fantastic.
The springtime, but it comes out in full blossom, and this big purple tree in the middle of the cemetery. Just a gorgeous place. But the thing I love about this cemetery is when they, so as you say, they accurately remapped it after the war, and then recreated the cemetery and built the permanent cemetery. They did bring in a few isolated graves, but apart from that, the cemetery that you're seeing now is the one that was created during the Gallipoli campaign. So again, it itself is a very, very big link. There's 683 graves in the cemetery, and as you'd imagine, because these men were being brought down and buried, it's not a frontline cemetery, only 85 are unidentified, so most of the men in this cemetery are identified. Interesting, just in a little aside, Pete, I was looking at a photo of the original cemetery from the 1920s when the permanent headstones had been put in place, and then I compared that to a modern image of the cemetery. The headstones in the 1920s were not as evenly spaced as they are now. So over time, the headstones have actually slightly moved as well, as And it doesn't matter. It doesn't, it doesn't matter that Corporal Smith is actually buried a few inches away from his headstone. But it's interesting how, as time's gone on over the decades, if headstones need to be taken away and maintained, or they need to adjust something in the garden, when they've come back, they've just naturally evenly spaced the headstones to have some aspect of symmetry. But originally, the headstones were grouped all over the place. They haven't moved very much. The gaps have not changed that much. But the cemetery's a lot neater and a lot more even than it was when it was originally laid out.
I think full stop throughout the whole of the CWGC cemeteries, you'll find if you start looking at photographs of almost any cemetery taken just after the war or at a period even perhaps during the war, and then you look at where the graves are now and you think, well, that doesn't quite match at all, and you realise that certainly there was some lining up of headstones and making the cemeteries look a little bit more uniform. And I've even noticed on one where the headstones are definitely at their feet and not at their heads any longer. They were moved so they were at their feet, and so there's a lot of things done, I think, to improve the look. But also you have to think they were looking long term. These cemeteries have to be maintained, and it's difficult if the graves are absolutely everywhere. I don't find it a problem if Private Smith isn't directly beneath his headstone. I don't think it matters. His marker is there because he is there, but whether he's directly beneath it or not, I think is to a certain extent irrelevant, really. Perhaps we all like to think that every single soldier is directly below his marker, and I think the majority are, but certainly from when we look at the photographs, and unless they started moving people, which we know they didn't, then it's a tidying of the headstones really that's taking place.
To give us a bit of a perspective on what it was like during the campaign, there's a good quote here from early May from Chaplain Ernest Merrington, and of course the chaplains. We should do a podcast on military chaplains, Pete, because they did good work.
I find that I'm very interested in military chaplains, and I've got quite a large number of books about military chaplains, and I think the quote that you're just going to read is just a fantastic quote.
So this was Ernest Merrington, Chaplain Ernest Merrington, who was at the cemetery in early May, and here's how he described the scene that he saw at the cemetery. The bullets often fell thickly around our little parties of workers on this site, which has become forever sacred to Australians and New Zealanders. I was down there by myself at dawn and found the fallen men laid side by side ready for interment. For hours I worked, laying the bodies in the graves with no assistance except for a few men of a fatigue party making a track nearby. I placed the identity discs and personal effects at the head of each grave. I counted 42 Australians and 10 Turks. The sun arose over the eastern hill, revealing the awesome scene around me of death, nobility, valour and sacrifice. That's what he wrote in his diary. A couple of really interesting things, Pete, there that could otherwise be overlooked. Firstly, the suggestion that there were 10 Turks buried in the cemetery. There's certainly absolutely no Turkish graves whatsoever. So and there's no record that Turkish graves were removed from that cemetery. So I don't actually believe they buried any Turks next to the Australians in that cemetery. The Turks were usually disposed of in mass graves nearby. But that's an interesting one. But also that he placed the identity discs on the graves. That shows why, especially on the Western Front, a little bit at Gallipoli, but especially on the Western Front, why so many men who were originally buried are then missing. I mean, Pete, you know a huge amount about the cemeteries, both the Western Front and Gallipoli. It's a really interesting perspective, isn't it, on how they were created in the first place?
It is, and it's an interesting perspective on how I presume that he's putting the identity discs around the rough markers because they haven't yet created any kind of marker with their names on them. So if you haven't got the time to do that, what else do you do? Well, the only thing to do is to nail or hang the identity disc around the cross. But you're right, that is thereby the problem. Because at this period they only have one identity disc. So if he's removed it from the body to hang on the cross, then that's it. Once that's gone, then he will not be able to be identified because he's no longer got a disc on his remains. It's one of the reasons why they went over to. Again, we could go on to a whole podcast about identity discs, but it's one of the reasons why they went to a two-part disc after the Gallipoli campaign to ensure that the men had two discs on with them.
It's also interesting, he says he put the personal effects at the head of the grave as well, diaries and cigarette tins and anything else he found. So those obviously would not have lasted long especially. No. I think, again, it reflects that no one knew what was coming. This is in May. This is in early May, so this was only a couple of weeks after the landing. No one had any idea what was going to happen and how long this campaign was going to go on, and the fact that they would still be in the same spot 8 months later, that the line would not have moved. They all felt that obviously the feeling must have been at that time that, well, we're not going to be here for long. We're going to push inland and capture the whole peninsula. And this will just simply be a cemetery in the rear area. They had no idea it would stay in effectively in the front line for as long as it did. And then they would have to evacuate and abandon it in 8 months' time. Extraordinary.
We all did it. The Germans here in my village where I live in Flare, there was a big German cemetery that was a permanent German cemetery. It's at the period when the Germans thought they were here to stay. So they started building a permanent cemetery, walls and flower arbours and bronze memorials and all sorts in the German cemetery here. Now gone. There's nothing left of it. So it's gone. And even when we didn't expect the Germans to come back after the pushing them back to the Hindenburg line, we started building permanent cemeteries, getting our cemeteries ready, and of course they're all going to be overrun in the period when the Germans in 1918 as the Grey Avalanche headed towards the coast. And so again, we all lose cemeteries and lost the information from those cemeteries and had to start working to reevaluate them and to find out who was buried in them. Just an enormous job. I just find it mind-boggling, the amount of effort that's going to go into it.
There's a number of a number of well-known, notable people buried in the cemetery, and it's well worth, when you go to Shrapnel Valley Cemetery, just spending a bit of time wandering around looking at the headstones, because there's quite a remarkable number of people there. But probably one of the standouts is Major Hugh Quinn, that Quinn's Post is named after. He was killed in the Turkish attack on the 29th of May. The 19th of May was the Great Turkish Attack, so he was killed in that attack, and he's buried there in Shrapnel Valley. But lots of interesting graves, so well worth a good walk around Shrapnel Valley Cemetery, just noting men killed in every aspect of the campaign.
I think that's an interesting one as well, Matt, because it shows how revered senior officers were carried far enough away from the front line to ensure that they got a proper burial, because that wouldn't be the case for everybody there. But you can imagine the effort needed to bring his body down from the front line and bring it all the way back to the cemetery would have been it's a fair old difficult walk with a dead man, effectively.
And there's a lot of officers buried here as well. So I think you're right, Pete. That was reflected that when officers were killed, this was one of the main points that they were buried. They weren't left up. A lot of the men, as you say, were buried in just rough graves up near the front line, but the officers generally were carried down. You're right, as a mark of respect. One thing you can do when you finish at Shrapnel Valley, if you're feeling fit, there is a track up the hill to Pluggy's Plateau, and you should absolutely do this. It's a side tour in my book, and we probably in this podcast don't have time to go into all the detail because there's a lot to see up at Pluggy's Plateau. But absolutely, you should head up there. There's a rough track that heads up for maybe 1.5 kilometres all the way up to Pluggy's Plateau. And Pluggy's is one of the main points that overlooks the beach, one of the most important geographic features overlooking Anzac Cove. It's where the men charged up, and as you head up, you get great views over Anzac Cove. You can see the piers heading off. You get wonderful views over the gullies. You can see where Monash's headquarters was in the gullies, and it's just absolutely. There's artillery positions up there. It's just quite amazing. And then when you get to the top, you get this amazing little cemetery, this tiny little cemetery at the top, which is absolutely extraordinary. Pluggy's Plateau Cemetery. It's crazy that it's there, because after the war, the whole point with the building of permanent cemeteries was, let's put them in places where they're easy to get to for gardeners, where they can be maintained, and where visitors can get to them easily. Pluggy's Plateau Cemetery is the exact opposite of all of that. It's isolated, hard to get to. I can't imagine the poor gardeners in the 1920s trying to do their work to keep the thing maintained. But I love that. I think part of it is it was Lieutenant Cyril Hughes from the Light Horse who came back after the campaign. He was in charge of deciding what cemeteries would remain. And I think as a Light Horse man, I just think he liked it. I just think he felt it was appropriate that you have 30 or 40 blokes in this little cemetery where they fell from the early days of the campaign. I think he just liked it. And so he said, yep, we're leaving that one in place, boys. Get to work.
I can relate to the fact of why he liked it. It is absolutely stunning. One of my little pet hates is when my clients want to talk to me while I'm making that climb to the cemetery. Oh my God, that is just a horrendous climb. I have to say, very interesting. I had a very interesting experience a few years ago. In fact, probably the last time I was there. And I was just having a quick look in one of the artillery positions that were there, just trying to figure out where the gun would have sat and what its field of fire would have been. And I slipped as I was coming out and nearly nose planted the ground. And as I looked down, I saw something and I recognised immediately from the Western Front, and it was just a little tiny fragment of a soldier's toothbrush sticking out of the ground. I was able to just pull it out, and I pulled out a First World War soldier's toothbrush just from one of these artillery positions. Just extraordinary, very moving to find something so personal.
That's absolutely brilliant. It's just such a great spot. I mean, I do spend hours on Pluggy's Plateau when I go there. It's just such a remarkable spot, and so linked with the landing and the evacuation and every other chapter of the campaign. There are artillery positions up here, which you still find the dugouts for field guns. Just a great spot. Yeah. The cemetery itself is the smallest cemetery at Gallipoli, the smallest one on the peninsula. There's only 21 men buried there, and 11 of the men that are buried there of the 21 were killed on the opening day, on the 25th of April. Just an extraordinary spot. And then if you go to the front of the plateau, you get incredible views out across Anzac Cove. And then what you should do is walk past the cemetery to the back of the plateau, and then you get incredible views up all the tangle of gullies where the Australians fought, particularly in the opening days. And there's a sliver of land that links you to the next height, and that was known as the Razor Edge. And it's this sliver of land. And this was one of the problems of the landing, is that on the maps it looked like Pluggy's Plateau was linked to Russell's Top, the high ground, but it wasn't. The only bit of land that connected it was this skinny little shelf called the Razor's Edge. And some of the brave Aussies who landed on the first day actually did run across it, but most people didn't make the crossing. And you can do it today, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's a pretty torturous journey up to Russell's Top, so I'd recommend you don't do it. But just outstanding views from Pluggy's Plateau.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really great spot. You can see across the Sphinx as well. Opposite, it's just an extraordinary spot. We're going to head back down now to Shrapnel Valley Cemetery, and then we're going to keep walking down the road, and we're going to turn right to Beach Cemetery, one of the last stops on our journey. We're going to go to Beach Cemetery. Gorgeous place. Beach Cemetery is on the spit of land known as Hell Spit to the Anzacs, again reflecting the nature of the fire, particularly from the south. There was the big promontory to the south is called Garba Tepe, and on Garba Tepe were the gun or guns known as Beachy Bill, which we mentioned in the last podcast, and they blasted away at this southern sector of the of Anzac Cove, and so this spit of land was known as Hell Spit. In spite of its exposure, Pete, they still built a cemetery on it. Quite remarkable, because the hospital was next to it.
Yeah, I think this was an immediate burial place. So these were guys killed in or the initial people buried here in the first few days of the landing, before they realised that there was a much better and sheltered place to bury soldiers in Shrapnel Valley. So, but it's just amazing that you would continue to use it, because it was continued. They used it throughout the whole of the campaign. There's 391 graves buried here, and I have to say, very difficult to say which is my favourite cemetery in the Anzac sector, but this one again is beautiful because it's just right on the beach. It's lots of trees, tends to be a little bit cool there. You get a sea breeze occasionally, and you have to say, sadly, if you had to have died and be buried somewhere on the during this campaign, then this would be where I would want to lie. I think it's a beautiful place.
It's an extraordinary cemetery, just gorgeous. And erosion there used to be a beach in front of it, but erosion has gotten rid of that beach now. So now the cemetery literally tumbles down into the ocean. So it's this beautiful, it's very sloped, heads down, headstones, beautiful gardens, nice trees, and then just beautiful blue water. It's an absolutely extraordinary spot. And again, lots of people say this is their favourite cemetery at Gallipoli. I probably prefer Araburnoo. There's something about Araburnoo that I prefer at the northern end, but it is a beautiful cemetery. And it's got some of the most important graves at Gallipoli. Let's talk about him. Simpson, the man with the donkey. John Simpson is buried here. We won't get too bogged down. And again, perhaps another podcast will talk all about him. But the most fascinating thing, the most famous Australian to serve at Gallipoli. And what's the most important thing about him when we say that, Pete?
He's not Australian.
South Shields. He was from way up in the north. He was a Geordie.
Yeah. He was a little bit further north than myself. I'm from Hull, east coast as well, east coast of Britain, and he came from a little bit further up the coast.
It was funny. I saw some researchers who were looking into the myth of Simpson and whether he was as famous at the time as we made him later on, and they came to the conclusion that he's barely mentioned in diaries and personal accounts. And if he was such a big deal, more men would have mentioned him. But then they noticed that they'd made a fateful error. No one referred to him as Simpson. He had such a broad northern English accent that the Australians called him Scotty. It was his nickname because they thought he was Scottish when they heard him talk. and so his nickname was Scotty. And so once they came across this, they started looking, and there were references everywhere to him in diaries and letters. And when he was killed, only a few weeks into the campaign, we forget how long he was killed, very early in the campaign. And so it's quite extraordinary that so many men remembered him, and so his fame was established at Gallipoli. He was even mentioned in the official history of the campaign. So his fame was. I think it's just one of those things. We just need. We need heroes. We need people in the midst of all the hell. We need people doing good things, and the man with a donkey is. Rescuing wounded is a perfect example of that. So the most popular grave visited in the Anzac sector is Simpson, the man with a donkey.
I mean, it was a good news story in a way, wasn't it? Because it's sad, really, because of course he's killed, but it's seen as a good news story. This brave chap going up and down the gullies, bringing back the wounded, and I think even the donkey has a slight religious overtones as well, doesn't it? So it's the donkey, and I just think the whole story had that nice feel to it of in a period of time when there were not particularly very many good stories that you could tell. So I think it was seen as a human story in a period of massive suffering for a lot of the men that were there.
It also was a good, I won't say a propaganda piece, but it was a good news story insofar as the campaign was not going well, and rather than celebrate great military victories, what we started to celebrate was the grit and determination of the men to hang on, and so Simpson was pretty representative of that. Men doing good things in tough conditions. So he's well deserved. His fame is well deserved. But remember that he wasn't Australian, because he's a great.
And he wasn't the only one. I think that's the other thing, isn't it? There were an awful lot of other men doing exactly the same task, and I think there's been some debate about the only supposed picture that we have of him is now, I think, presumed to be a New Zealander and not Simpson at all. But it doesn't really matter, whether he was a New Zealander or Simpson. They're doing the same job, and it was a tough job.
Peter Hart and Gary Bain on our sister podcast, Pete and Gary's Military History, did a whole episode about Simpson and the other stretcher bearers using donkeys at Gallipoli. So certainly go and listen to that. It was it's a fascinating story, and one of the key elements we hang on to about the Gallipoli campaign. But there's other interesting people buried in Beach Cemetery as well, Pete. One of the ones that I like the best is Captain Edward Badge, because he'd been on Douglas Mawson's Antarctic expedition in the earlier part of the decade, and this is quite extraordinary. These men that went off and explored the Arctic, and it touches with one of the blokes that the Antarctic explorer that you mentioned from the Noir episode a few weeks ago.
Russell Blake. Yeah, Russell Blake, also on the same expedition, and also will lose his life during the war. In this case, Russell Blake lost his life on the 3rd of October in 1918. And Badge will lose his life on the 7th of May in 1915. Badge being the astronomer and Blake being the cartographer. And of course we have Frank Haley, the Australian official photographer, was also on the same expedition as well. So it's a fascinating expedition, and I having realised that Badge was here and is buried in this cemetery, I've decided I'm going to do a little bit more work on that expedition, Mawson's Antarctic expedition 1911-14, and see who else was on there, because it's obviously full of very interesting characters.
It's amazing, isn't it? And it just shows these men were adventurers and heroes, and so they were explorers, and they went off and fought in a war. It makes perfect sense. But some other really important officers buried here. So there's George Braund is really important. He was the commander of the 2nd Battalion, very well liked by his men. He led very successfully during the opening days. Braund's Hill, which leads, is one of the main hills at Gallipoli, is named after him. But on the 4th of May, he was challenged by an Australian sentry, and he was slightly deaf, didn't hear the challenge, and the sentry shot him dead. So killed by an Australian as he entered the lines, which was a tragedy. So the 2nd Battalion lost its charismatic commander. And also, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Lancelot Clark, Boer War veteran, commander of the 12th Battalion. And he was 57 years old at the time on the day of the landing. He scaled up the side of the Sphinx, which is like ground that I don't think anyone attempted to climb ever again. And I would never, it's a sheer cliff. So he scaled up there, and he led his men forward all the way to the ground that became the neck on the first day. And he was, calling out to his men and yelling them to come on the day of the landing, and a shot rang out and he was killed. And he's buried in Beach Cemetery. So and there's more as well. There's other important officers there. There's some really extraordinary graves in Beach Cemetery. Really worth spending some time just exploring that area. What was the one? I'm remembering. I'm going to look back to my notes. Was it the Ceylon Planters Rifles? I think
it was indeed.
Yeah, they were Birdwood's personal guard at Gallipoli.
It's personal bodyguard, Ceylon Planters Rifle Corps. Yeah, not enough of them to form any kind of sensible unit, and Birdwood needed a bodyguard, so they volunteered or were picked. I'm never quite sure which, but they became his personal bodyguard and retinue, I suppose, that served with him on the peninsula.
So there's 3 of that guard are buried in the cemetery. Obviously, they were unfortunate, didn't survive. But
I'm going to go off on one of my tangents, if I may briefly.
Please do.
Many years ago, in an auction in the UK, I always rummaged through boxes to have a look inside old boxes to see what I could find, and there were 3 boxes piled on top of each other. And I went to the bottom box and I just lifted the lid, having moved the boxes on top of it, and then shut the lid again very quickly, because what I could glimpse inside was a tropical helmet and a uniform and all of his accoutrements to a First World War officer. So I piled the other boxes on top and then bought all 3 boxes, which were supposed to be empty. And it turned out that the uniform in the bottom box was of the Ceylon Planters Rifle Corps of the First World War period. So it was a complete uniform of a soldier that had served on the peninsula.
Absolutely brilliant. That's a great story.
It is. I've sold it, sadly. I sold it some years ago, and I wish I hadn't now.
I was about to say, Pete's actually wearing it as he does this podcast. I look at him on the video screen, but no, that would have been great. But I would have loved to have seen you sitting up there in your pith helmet, Pete. That would have been...
I can do that. I've got others just behind me. I've got others.
Well, we're going to farewell the Ceylon Planters Rifles and all the other men in Beach Cemetery. We're going to head back to the road, and then this is the last stop on our tour. We're going to take a right. We're going to walk down a little bit further until we come to the next big, sweeping, exposed stretch of sand, which is Brighton Beach, which stretches all the way from Hellspit all the way down to Gaba Tepe. It didn't feature particularly prominently in the campaign, except for the concept that most of the men were supposed to land here. But it's still a good place to go because there's a couple of fascinating stories to do with Brighton Beach and the Gallipoli campaign. So what we should remember is it was only the very northern end of the beach that was actually in Anzac hands. The rest of the beach was unoccupied, and the Turks overlooked it. So it was actually a pretty dangerous stretch. We've been there. It's a good spot for a swim in the summer. There's not, it doesn't actually play that huge a role in the campaign, particularly the landings.
Yep, I've had a swim there. It's been one of my kind of little sidelines when we visit the battlefields, is to have a swim on every beach. I've done most of the Normandy landing beaches, so very necessary to have a swim on the beaches at Gallipoli as well.
As did literally tens of thousands of Aussies and New Zealanders during the campaign. The little corner of Brighton Beach was always a good swimming spot. And actually it reminds me of probably the most famous story to do with Brighton Beach, which occurred after the May Turkish offensives, when the Turks launched a huge attack to try and push the Allies into the sea and suffered probably 10,000 casualties. And no man's land was choked with bodies, and it was just a ghastly sight. And so the Turks sent down an envoy under a white flag to negotiate a ceasefire so they could bury the troops. And this is one of my favourite stories of the Gallipoli campaign. So they sent down an officer, and the Anzacs promptly blindfolded him, and he walked along Brighton Beach. They blindfolded him so that he could come in and negotiate the truce without seeing the Anzac defences. But there was a barbed wire entanglement which stretched down across Brighton Beach and into the water, and trying to get a blindfolded man across barbed wire entanglement was a difficult challenge, and they couldn't get him to do it. Charles Bean was there, the official historian, and he described it was like one of those games where you tell someone that they blindfold them and tell them they're stepping over an imaginary obstacle, that try to direct him to lift his legs at the right time. Anyway, it wasn't working at all. They couldn't get him through the barbed wire, and then someone had a brainwave. There were a couple of Aussies swimming naked, stark naked in the water nearby. So they got a stretcher. They sat the Turk on the stretcher. Then the 2 naked Aussies carried the Turk on the stretcher down into the water and around the end of the barbed wire entanglement. And Charles Bean actually has a photo of this moment of the 2 naked Aussies carrying the Turkish envoy who was sitting on a stretcher. So quite a funny one. But then afterwards, during the actual truce itself, again, another one of my favourite anecdotes about Gallipoli, the Turkish officers had come down, the Anzac officers were all there, British officers, and they were all discussing this truce very formally and no doubt trying to preserve the dignity of their nation. And then all of a sudden, the flap on the tent flew open and this head appeared as an Aussie stuck his head in and said, "Hey, did one of you muckers pinch my kettle?" in the middle of the truce conference. So brilliant. I just love that. It's just it's just that sums that sums up the Gallipoli campaign, is the officers trying to do their best to forge some sense of order in the middle of this chaos, and the troops doing their best to muck that up at every opportunity. It's a really good spot. Brighton Beach is a good spot to end the walk, and you look down south towards the Turkish defences at Gaba Tepe and all the land that wasn't occupied by the Anzacs, and it's a good spot to finish the tour. And that really brings us to an end, Pete. It's an essential walk, isn't it? I mean, it's the iconic walk, at least in the Anzac sector. Even if you're not an Australian or a New Zealander, to go down and stroll along those beaches and visit those sites it's just absolutely essential. An incredible walk.
It's fantastic, and the views, if you just climb up the bluffs a little bit to the ridges, just fantastic, back down onto the beaches, and and you will find it, for anybody that's not been before, you'll find it extraordinary, because it will not feel as you think it's going to feel, and certainly that was my experience on my first visit.
Wonderful. Well, Pete, thank you for joining us once again. It's been a wonderful walk, and look forward to the next one.
Yep, can't wait.